Welcome. So in this video, my goal is to take you through the new user interface that came out in the 721 release. I've looked online and I've seen a couple of videos that were posted. For example, the screen that you see or the picture that you see on the screen, at the bottom, that URL will take you to the video that was posted by our design team. It's a 2-minute video that kind of gives you a very high level glimpse as far as what you get with the user interface. I thought I would take it a little bit further and give you some practical usage things, how I would go ahead and actually take advantage of the tool. So for starters, I thought I would go through the actual user interface architecture and the way that it's intended to be used. So you get SMUI packages in the actual software, so this isn't something that you have to pay for separately. It's included with the 721 release. The agent file set would get installed on all the cluster members. There is a set of, there's a server package. You can opt to install it on one of the cluster members, or you can install it in a separate LPAR, and that effectively can become your gateway server that would allow you to view and on phase one only monitor the environments. Phase two of the UI, which you'll see later this year, should be giving you administrative controls. So as far as the install, it's pretty straightforward. Once you get in there, you do have a couple of options as far as the supported browsers. You've got Chrome and Firefox. I've used Safari just to see if it would let me in. I can totally have viewability into the cluster, but some of the things like the log viewability and the parsing doesn't load properly. So I suspect that that's why the development team is kind of pushing Chrome and Firefox. As far as the very first release that we came out with last December, the 721 GA code only lets you view 721 clusters. So you could not, have visibility from the user interface to anything older than 721. In June of this year, when Service Pack 1 came out, we did introduce now the ability to view 721 720 and 713 clusters. I highlighted the service packs on the right hand side as far as what you would need in order to be able to go ahead and have viewability from the user interface. And then as far as the supported managed levels, AIX wise, whatever you need as the minimum requirements for that PowerHA release will be supported. So AIX 6, AIX 7, and AIX 7.2. My particular demo environment, I opted not to go with the best practice configuration where you have a separate server deployed um, to be the management LPAR. I went ahead and I loaded the server code on one of the cluster members. My original intent was to load the server code on both of them and hit one UI whenever both nodes were active, and if I had a failure of that node, I would hit the second UI. But then I was told that really you should be running that server code in a single LPAR. You should not do it in the fashion that I was doing it. You don't want to have multiple managers in this particular release. Um, you just won't get good results. So try to avoid that. So that's why I wanted to highlight the fact that I did it not following best practices, but if you do choose to go down this path, only install the server code on one of the cluster members. And then I did discover that although I could pick up my cluster and see the information, I was not getting the menus to load 100% of the way. And then I found out that the CAA hostname, the way that it's actually stored in there, has to match the actual system hostname. So if you have a fully qualified name for the hostname in ClusterAware AIX, you want your actual system hostname to be the fully qualified name. And I'll show you that when I dive deeper into the actual demo portion itself. I did go ahead and register a second cluster for my environment. It unfortunately was a 721 cluster. I'm looking to go ahead and also discover additional clusters running the older releases. I already have Service Pack 1 in place, but this particular demo environment is going to have two clusters, one with 2 nodes, one with 3 nodes, but they are both running the later releases or the more current releases. As far as the new user interface, the phase one is really intended to have viewability into the environment, so you can monitor things, you can parse through the logs, you can filter through the logs, which is really nice, but really you're logging in as root. Um, when you get in, you have the dashboard view that you were seeing on the right hand side. That left hand side will typically be expanded by default, so that's where you would see your cluster. You would be able to identify where the resource groups are online or not online. I'm showing it expanded for cluster 1. I do have a second cluster on the bottom that's not expanded. And then things like the dashboard kind of give me a count. Everything looks green, so it's nice to quickly identify. I've got 2 clusters, 5 nodes, 5 resource groups. Everything appears green, no issues. The piece that I was saying with the host names not matching, so that timeline that you have there will not load any actual information unless those host names match. And that's the behavior that I was experiencing in my environment. Also, the expanded events with descriptions, that information doesn't load either. That's why I wanted to really highlight the fact that those host names should actually match. And phase 2 should give you the administrative controls. So what you'll see in today's demo is me going in, looking at the environment and showing you some of the practical things that you can do. You do not have the ability to start things, stop things, or move resources around. So just be mindful of that. I expect an update before the end of this year. So you'll see a follow-on video with some of those administrative capabilities. The log viewer is really handy, so I'll dive a little bit deeper when I get into the actual demo portion. So if you're clicked onto one of the clusters, so on the left-hand side, you see I was, I have it minimized, but I was in cluster 1, which is called PowerHA V721 test cluster. I happen to be in the logs section. And notice that there's a bunch of real estate on the right-hand side. Again, in the follow-on releases, you'll see that you'll have even more stuff available to you. But in this one, you can search through the logs, which is really handy. So I'll show you some, use cases there. And then you can see multiple logs side by side. Here I'm showing 2. You can load up to 4. So you would see 2 and then have to scroll to the left or to the right. Obviously, if the screen was a little bit bigger, I can make them even bigger. And if it's not big enough, you can go ahead and click on the little arrow and have a single separate window that will get launched that you can search through, and you can also take advantage of the stickies where you can expand things. I'll show you a screenshot of that in just a minute. And if you wanted to dive in and truly perform administrative actions, there is an actual open terminal, similar to a vTerm on the HMC, but probably a little bit beefier than that. And from there, you can have full root authority and perform administrative functions in the environment. And I'll show you a screenshot of that as well. So if I did click on the arrow where I expanded the log itself, the nice thing is that now from my browser, I can take advantage of the search capabilities. So now I'm not having to go into the actual PuTTY session and grep things out or start kind of parsing through in a messier way. Here I can search through and I can, match the case, go forwards, backwards, and I can scroll. And then the expanded sections. So if I click on those stickies that you see, this happens to be an example of the error report. This is handy for things like the HACMP.out file that have, the high-level events, but inside, sometimes you want to see the information, sometimes it doesn't make sense to see the information. So if I click on that, it'll expand it, and I can see, the details for that particular, section. So this was telling me that my var file system was full. If I wanted to read it, I could expand it. And then, like I was saying earlier, if I needed to open up a terminal, if had I clicked on that button, it'll ask me, hey, which one of the node members do you want to go into? As long as I've got, my SSH enabled, launch the open terminal, and then I can perform full administrative functions from that particular session. So at the bottom right, I'm showing, and you'll see it when I get into the demo. I ran a CLRG info there just to show you, my resource groups in the particular environment, but I can perform any type of actions. I can, view SMIT and get into SMIT SysMirror if I wanted to follow that approach as well. Next, I'll go into the actual demo portion itself. So in this next session, I thought I would show you the couple logins that I've got into the environment. Prior to going into the GUI, I said that you wanted things like the actual host names in cluster-aware AIX and in the actual system itself to match. So I've got windows open into node A, node B, and then I have another one on the bottom open up to node A. So I'll just run a couple quick commands and show you some of the same information that I was alluding to earlier. So in my environment, if I do an lssrc-a and I just grep for the UI agents, you'll notice that on my node A, I have the server actually active and then the agent. And if you look at the second cluster member, I run the same exact thing. You'll see that I've only got the agent running, and that's where I was saying you don't want to have 2 servers running to manage the environment. You just want to have one. Mine just happens to be one of the actual cluster members. If I just go back to node A on the bottom, so same exact cluster member, but I figured I'd keep up some of the things on the screen. and we check for the actual file sets that are installed. The main difference here for Node A is this particular server package. So cluster ESSMUI server is the one that I was alluding to. That one is not installed on my Node B, and that's why the server agent or the server daemon is not actually active there. As far as the names themselves, if you take a look and you pulled CAA or cluster aware AIX, and I did something like an ls cluster-c, you'll see that it's recognizing the actual nodes, and it does have the actual long name. And that's where I didn't even realize that CAA, the way that it stores the information, happens to be one way. I could go ahead and change this, but because it was already that way, my host names before were the actual short name, and I came back in and addressed my inconsistency issue with the user interface by fixing my host names so that they also had the fully qualified domain name. If you look at my actual node names themselves in the cluster, HACMP node, and I'm going to probe the ODM real quick on the bottom. If I do an ODM get against that object class, you'll see that I have stanzas that reflect my node name itself. Obviously doesn't have the fully qualified domain name. If I continue to scroll down, for each one of the nodes, you'll have a communication path entry, and there it actually is showing the long name. I'm not sure that that one really matters, but you do care about the actual system host name and what CAA is actually storing. So just wanted to show you what I had in my environment. The cluster is actually actively running. So if I do an HA level -s, it's showing you that it's running 721 service pack 1. Same information as far as the OS is concerned. And I do have a little wrapper script to tell, the current status of the cluster manager daemon. So node B, it's showing stable. So if cluster services are truly active hosting things over there. If I come back to this bottom window, I'll show you clrginfo-p just to show you I do have two resource groups, app1 resource group and app2 resource group. App1 happens to be online on Node A. I do have sites defined in this particular configuration. That's why you see the online secondary states. And then the app2 resource group is actually active on Node B, which is part of Site B. And I did that primarily, even though it's a local cluster, so I could experiment with the split and merge policies that we introduced in the releases. The last piece, I guess, now is to go into the user interface itself. So I'll show you the GUI front end, and then I'll come back to this a little bit later where I perform, a movement action, such as like moving, for example, app1 resource group currently hosted on Node A. I'll move them to Node B from the command line, and then at the same time I'll show you what it looks like from the user interface and how long it takes for it to actually pick up the change. So finally, let's go ahead and get into the GUI itself. If you look up on top, I'm connecting to Node A. That is the default page. And then I am going to go ahead and log in as the root user. As I stated, that is the only user that you can use on phase 1 of the UI deploy. And once I get in, you'll see that I've already discovered a number of things. The immediate view will show you the actual dashboard that I was showing you the screenshot off before. I am logged in as root up on the top. My only options are to either be in there or to log out. Again, be on the lookout for the additional releases where you'll get some expanded functionality. And maybe I don't want to see the dashboard or the timeline itself in the center. So you can hide those things if you needed the actual real estate. You can kind of tuck those guys away. I kind of like to see them. And what you'll notice is the high level view goes away when you're clicked into one of the clusters. Right now, since I'm viewing all the event summaries, I'm getting the information for everything in one shot on the right hand side. So the events, if I were to parse through on the bottom, are specific to, some of them are MH Oracle cluster, and I'm sure as I continue to go down, you'll see that there was some activity for my other cluster as well. These guys and the timeline itself, I can zoom in and zoom out. The closer that I get into the timeline itself, you'll see that it's not that 17 specific things are all kind of, well, it's basically a grouping. So that the more that I zoom in into that particular section, as I get closer in, what you would see is that that section will start breaking out even further. And I guess I have to go pretty far in. And because of the recording, I've got a slight bit of lag. So I'm on a Mac and I can use my, two-finger scroll to zoom in and zoom out. Normally it works pretty fluidly, but you'll start to see things like, uh, you know, click on one of the maintenance events. It tells you that some activity was taking place. It's got a timestamp. Maybe you don't know what a reconfig resource complete means. You know that it took place, but it doesn't mean anything to you. The nice thing that they added, as far as the events that are getting loaded on the bottom, is if I click on that hyperlink, it does take me to a description of what that event is. So if I haven't seen that event before, or if that's the reason that the cluster experienced an issue, I can go ahead and add a note and say, hey, um, this was what caused the problem in November. And I can submit it and it'll get stored. And if somebody else logs into the GUI, they'd be able to see your notes for that specific event, which is actually kind of handy. When I was saying earlier that you can open the logs, I'll show you that section. You can do it from here and it'll take you directly to the log where it shows you those events, or you can open up the terminal that I mentioned earlier. We'll do that shortly, but let me come back in, expand my view, and I was mentioning that you can monitor the status of your cluster. I happen to have sites defined, so I've got site A and site B for my first cluster. Node A is currently hosting app1rg. That's why he says online primary. Again, I had sites, so really my app2 resource group is online on site B sitting on node B. So you'll see app2 is online primary there, online secondary because that's the next available target. But you get a nice view, and the reason that everything shows up green on the dashboard is because everything is green on the back end. So it matches what's in the CLRG info output that you might be used to looking at. When I'm clicked on the cluster itself, you'll see that the dashboard changes. Now it's only showing me that there's 2 nodes and 2 resource groups because that's how many there are for this particular cluster. And where I was saying that you can do searches through the events that are kind of handy, maybe I want to see the last time that an RG move actually took place. And what you'll see is as I'm typing, it's filtering the events on the bottom and it's showing me RG move complete, RG moves. Maybe I care about the most recent one, which would have been here, and maybe I want to get some details about it. So it's just handy that I can kind of float back and forth, get the expanded views, and kind of filter through. Now, if I'm clicked into that, same cluster over here, so I'm in the event summary section. I'll get into the logs in just a minute. In prior releases where we had things like WebSmith, there was a nice cluster report that showed you the very attributes for the cluster. This one loads pretty quickly. If you look, you'll get some of the general settings, the type of cluster that I'm playing with. So there's the name, there's my release. This happens to be a stretched cluster configuration because I have site definitions. I do have the Enterprise Edition code installed. And then showing that it's fully synchronized, my heartbeat frequency. Sometimes some of those settings are a little bit hidden in the environment. I do have site definition, so I've got site A and site B. My node members, the current controlling node, so that's who the UI is actually handshaking with. And then some of the security settings, some of the tunables. These you can find, when you're logged onto the box, but it's kind of handy that they're there. And then I mentioned that I had site definitions, even though that this was a local cluster. I have been experimenting. You'll see that my other cluster has some different split and merge policies, and it actually is not a stretched cluster. My other one is a linked cluster. If I scroll further down, I have a repository disk on this one. It's a stretched cluster, so there's a single repository. I don't have any backups, but they would also show up here as well. And I happen to have file collections in the environment. Here they are actually enabled. And here you can see how the file collections are automatically keeping my files in sync. So my start and stop scripts are being constantly maintained so that if I make an edit, they automatically would get propagated to whatever other cluster member did not have those updates. I don't have any custom events. And then the last tab that you have available to use the network section, which just shows you the topology. This is a relatively simple local cluster. So what you see is I have 2 base IP addresses. Here you see my 2 boots. Since I only have a single one in each node, so that would be base 1, and then I have a shared floating service IP address. So this is a really simple cluster topology. So that's kind of the gist as far as what you get from the viewability. It's, okay stuff. You'll have a lot more stuff coming in the follow-on release, so be on the lookout for that. The log section, that's probably the one that I thought was the most usable in the environment. So once you get in here, you can parse through the logs. It's by default going to the HSCMP.out file, and you'll notice that it's basically painting the picture with the log information, and it's by default collapsing those stickies. So I can expand different sections if I was looking for a specific event, like an acquire service address that took place at this time. Maybe I didn't want to see all the details right up front, but when I wanted to dive in deep, this is handy, and it's pretty peppy. So I mean, I don't have to wait for it to really load. I am scrolling, relatively quickly, so it's kind of nice. If I needed more real estate, I could expand it, and I'll show you a view of that in just a minute. If I wanted to see the side-by-side HACMP.out files, I could do that. So I've got the one open for node B, I've got the one open for node A. Hey, maybe this doesn't give me enough space. Let me go ahead and collapse the log section. Gives me a little bit more space here. So now if I was comparing the left side to the right side, um, maybe I was looking for a specific section and I wanted to go up and down and then maybe expand it. It's just handy. Um, so if I wanted to dive in deeper, I could open up a terminal and perform administrative functions. Maybe I want to see more logs. Maybe I want to correlate the HACMP.out file to the error report. So I can go ahead and click on the error report. I've logged a few errors on this particular node. So it's giving me the nice ERPT view, but maybe I want to see the ERPT minus A. I can see the expanded view here. So this is, again, very handy. And if I needed a little bit more real estate, let's say I had a bunch of information, I could come in and make the log where it has its own window. And the nice thing about this is once it gets loaded, I can scroll through it really quickly. So I'm no longer having to play with, cat, more, grep, but I can do a control F. So maybe I'm looking for a particular RG move event at a particular time, and I don't have one that I wanted to highlight, so I just wanted to show you, some of the capabilities here. But I can quickly parse through. Again, I've got the stickies in place, so maybe this was the one I cared about. I can click on it and dive right in and see, hey, there was something going on there. Um, so just I can parse through it really quickly, close it up. Maybe I don't want to see this guy anymore, so I just close him, and I'm right back to where I started. But all the various important logs are here. So you see the CL utils log, you see the sys log, and it's giving me for both node A and node B. And as I continue to scroll down, maybe the CL verify log. So I've got that there for node A and node B. The auto verify log, so the nightly check that it's running at midnight, the cluster manager debug, and then the high level cluster.log. So you have viewability into all these things, and you can parse through and do searches, for specific events. So it makes it very quick to bounce back and forth. Um, these guys right here, when I have multiple logs open, so let's say I click on the cluster log as well, and I was saying that you can have up to 4 log files open. Maybe I'll open CL verify log file. Um, Again, I can parse through quickly, I can search through, I can expand them if needed. I'm only seeing 2 at a time. I mentioned that you would have the extra real estate, but maybe I wanted to see the ones that were on the right hand side. So I can scroll left to right. You see the little arrows that load. So it just makes it very handy. If I knocked it down to 1 log, um, obviously I would have a lot more space, or I could just launch it and make it bigger. And maybe I want to look at node B, but I want to compare him side by side with the cluster.log file. So I just simply clicked here and I said, move this log next to this particular log. So now I can see the side by side comparison. And again, in a use case where you might have had to have multiple putty sessions and now you can have the logs side by side, really it's the size of your screen that's going to dictate how many you can have open, or how much viewability you have into the environment. But really handy in the big scheme of things, and something that I wish we had had sooner in the product. Same thing here, node up, for example, and it's just by default pulling up node, but I could go forwards and backwards and I can search through the log files really easily. I can also drag these guys and put them in a different order. So it's dynamic in the sense that I can take the different log files here and put one after the other or one in between. So I can do it that way as well. Um, Let me just show you the last piece where if you come in and open up a terminal, for example, I do want to now come in and perform some administrative actions. This is nice that I can parse through it, but I want to fix something or I want to look at the log file through, what I would like to see typically in a putty session. So let me go ahead and go into Node A, and when I launch the terminal, it gives me a nice view, and I can go ahead and start performing commands. So clcmd, clstate, clrginfo-p, just to see where things are hosted. Very handy, resizable. It gives me full control. So if I want to do a SMIDI SysMirror, it'll paint the picture. It'll automatically size up to whatever it needs. I can scale this. So if I needed to have a better view for the video, I could make it a lot bigger. And I can simply close out and be right back to where I started. So some really cool things here. If I go back to when I said I was going to show you the actual status and how long it took for it to recognize a particular action, let's go ahead and do that now. So let me go back to view the event summaries just to have a different picture painted up on the side. But right now in my Node A, I have app1 resource group online. If I were to come in and just do a clrg info, which I already ran before, minus P, I get the same type of view. App 1 is currently sitting on Node A, but maybe I want to go ahead and do RG move. I want to go ahead and relocate that workload. So CL Manager, move RG, we'll move App 1 RG over to Node B, MHAJ72. And when I execute the operation, we know that it's running on the back end, and you already see it taking action on the user interface. It recognized that something's taken place. If you pay attention, it says that there's something warning, right? So it's just in an intermediary state. Not necessarily a bad thing, but there's definitely a move taking place. We just kicked it off, and you can see it. So this is a pretty vanilla cluster. So it's not like it's having to wait a long time to stop the application or anything like that. It's just coordinating within the cluster. Another nice thing is that I had 2 clusters in the environment. So anytime that any of the clusters go into some type of either critical state or some type of actions actually taking place, if you had a bunch of them in a row, it would put the ones that had activity taking place up on the top. So it would automatically sort them for you, which is nice. Here you see my app1rg is no longer online in Node A. I didn't have Node B expanded, but now I have app1 and app2 resource groups online on that node. And during the event taking place, since it was an external event, it did go ahead and lose communication with the node temporarily, but it came right back. The operation completed, and you see that the resource group is actually now online right here on node B, which is part of site B. That was me showing you the resource group move and how quick the operation was as far as the user interface, how quickly it detected it. The last piece that I thought might be interesting to show you is I didn't show you me adding the cluster into the actual config, but if I wanted to just remove it, this is just a view-only user interface. So I'm not hurting anything by doing a delete of the cluster configuration. I can go ahead and take them out, and I still have viewability to my original 3-node cluster. So 2 nodes sitting on site 1, 1 node sitting on site 2. And if I did want to pick them up again, I can come in 145 and pick him right up. And the operation should be relatively quickly. It went ahead and detected that there was a cluster out there. He's handshaking with the agent, and then it's going to take him a few seconds to go ahead and gather the data and then give me visibility into the logs, give me visibility into the different statuses. Let me open up a terminal session to get in there. So just really handy information and very handy interface. Definitely install it. It's not going to hurt anything. It's a view-only mode. If anything, it's going to get even better when the upcoming release gives you the administrative controls and additional visibility into the cluster. Hopefully you found this useful. Give us feedback, and have a nice day.